Hello, it's me, the Forbidden Thinker. Now I'm doing an article reading. Now, I've largely digged as far as I could go, and surprisingly enough, when I made my first video, I got one tiny little thing I messed up. Now, I didn't mess up anything factually, but I did mess up on where the link is to find the original, which it was already in the article, so I should have clicked on one of the links and it would have directed me there. But I will thank Stefanorian, of course, for providing me the link of the original copy of the article, which, again, I'll thank him for that. Now, let's continue to this insane article about how somehow the eclipse is racist. Because it fails to affect enough black people, The Atlantic suggests. Now, I will leave both articles in the description where you can read along. The Atlantic, a once great magazine, has determined that the total eclipse of the sun due to the occurrence on Monday will fail to affect enough black people. The Atlantic's very lengthy essay on the failure of the eclipse to occur with significant number of black people resides is entitled American Blackout. It clocks in at a remarkable 4,544 words and does not appear to be satire. Concerning the great American eclipse, Broken Law School Professor Alice, I can't pronounce her last name, writes, it rapidly deteriorating, or can't pronounce that either, magazine, three live almost no black people among most of its path. Basically what she's saying is that there live among no black people along its path, and she's basically suggesting that there's not that many people on the direct path of the eclipse that there are black people in terms. The Atlantic's long-winded law professor assures readers that the implicit bias of the solar system is prematurely not the case of an eclipse failure to affect enough black people. Okay. After reading this article and the one article that Seth Norton provided, yeah, that article doesn't appear to be satire. It's just a rambling of one professor who's just upset. But still, I mean, does the solar system have an implicit bias on race? I mean, okay, that sounds incredibly silly, just to me, like, okay, and it implies one question: does Jupiter have a bias about which race of people does does any of its moons does an eclipse? Just asking. Anyways, back to the article. Still, an eclipse chaser is always tempted to believe that the skies are relaying a message. Oregon, where the eclipse will first appear in the continental United States, is almost entirely white. There are very few black people in Oregonians. By the way, yes, that's a term for people that live in Oregon. It's Oregonians because I live in Oregon myself, just saying out there. And it's not an accident, it's totally on purpose. In 2017, the Atlantic claims because the Pacific Northwest state had a racial exclusion cause in its original 1857, the Atlantic notes that the eclipse will then move towards Wyoming and Idaho, which also have a low population of black people. After the extensive disclosure criticizing the U.S., the Atlantic tells readers that the eclipse will travel through Nebraska, Kansas, Iowa, and Missouri. In the section of its essay, the Atlantic manages to drop the names of Bruce, Jesse James, and Ehrman, and Klesia, and Mitchell Brown, and Howard Zen. Please forgive me, I can't sometimes there are words I can't pronounce completely. There are also, and the article continues, there are too many damn facts, the Atlantic also complains. After considerable whining about the Electoral College and the way the Congress is organized, the Atlantic moves on to southern Illinois, Kansas, and Tennessee's. There's a central discussion of the Ku Klux Klan, and it's in this section, and of course slavery, and related to the New York Times, a horrendous slave trader. Basically, the article that it's talking about deviates from the actual conversation about the eclipse, and it goes on to a few other sort of conversations. Next, the Atlantic traces the path of the eclipse overwhelmingly. Now it's getting back to the actual conversation. Good. Next, the Atlantic traces the path of the eclipse to overwhelmingly white rural areas in the Deep South. There's much discussion of the Civil War and much talk about the Gibb view, the American commerce having concerning Civil War history. Dylan Roof, which I don't understand why it's bringing up Dylan Roof. Like, how is he related to the eclipse? Just asking. Who murdered 9 people in the name of white supremacy, a race, a mention. In its final paragraph, the Atlantic concludes that the United States is still segregated. Really? It's still segregated? Oh, all this over an eclipse. And I'm starting to believe that the author of the Atlantic article is really just pissed off and just looking for something to whine about, which, again, I will have both articles onto the description. The reason why I'm reading this one is because the other one, I've already read it, but it's 10 times more lengthier, and I feel like this this video and that I'm making of the article, it best describes the Atlantic much easier in a shorter, in much shorter way where you can understand it. Anyways, the Atlantic classifies its article about the path of the eclipse in the category of science, even though it has nothing remotely approaching to science appears in any of its 4,544 words. And that's basically the end of the article. And again, I really think that the person that actually wrote the actual source, which is the Atlantic article, which is titled American Blackout, is kind of upset and is just looking for something to blame. And regardless if the states have less blacks and whites, doesn't imply that somehow the eclipse is biased. It's just a phenomenon that goes on regardless if there's people or not, and it doesn't really matter at all. Like, if it did, then it goes back to my question about Jupiter. Does Jupiter's eclipses really have an implicit bias? Like, again, this whole thing's silly to begin with, and I feel like I had to make a video responding to the American Blackouts through reading the other article, which does a much better job at condensing all that material into 4 or 5 paragraphs, which is a lot easier than reading something that's a lot bigger, I'll tell you. And yes, there is a term for Oregonians. For Oregon, it's Oregonians, for people that live there. It may seem weird, but a lot of people say it in Oregon, especially me. It's kind of a term that a lot of us have just adopted, but there's no real significance to it, so it's a whatever term. But anyways, thanks for watching. Please stay tuned for more, and remember that somehow the eclipse is racist. Somehow. Which I find to be silly.